In the late 8th century, Anglo-Saxon England was, well, a patchwork of kingdoms, a land of saints and scholars. It was a place where Christianity had taken deep root, and monasteries like Lindisfarne, perched on a tidal island off the coast of Northumbria, were centers of learning, art, and immense wealth. These holy sites were seen as untouchable, protected by God himself. The monks there scribed beautiful manuscripts, prayed for the souls of kings, and lived a life of quiet contemplation. No one could have imagined the storm that was about to break upon their shores. The world they knew, a world defined by familiar rivalries and a shared faith, was on the cusp of a violent and irreversible transformation that would arrive from across the gray North Sea. Then, on a summer's day in 793, the unthinkable happened. From the horizon came the sleek, terrifying shape of longships, their dragon-proud heads cutting through the waves like a predator closing in on its prey. These were the Vikings, warriors from Scandinavia, and they had come not to trade or settle, but to plunder. They crashed ashore at Lindisfarne with a ferocity that stunned the Christian world. The attack was swift, brutal, and sacrilegious. The monks, armed only with their faith, were slaughtered where they stood, or dragged into the sea to drown. The raiders cared nothing for the sanctity of the place. They saw only treasure. The news of the raid on Lindisfarne sent a shockwave across Europe. The scholar Alcuin of York, writing from the court of Charlemagne, lamented, "Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race." To the Anglo-Saxons, this was not just a military attack, it was a spiritual catastrophe. How could God allow his holy house to be desecrated, his servants murdered? It seemed like a punishment, a sign that the end of days was near. The raiders were described not as mere men, but as heathens, pagans, and wolves. The psychological impact was immense, sowing fear and uncertainty throughout the coastal communities of Britain and Ireland. This single, violent act marked the beginning of the Viking Age in England. It was a brutal announcement of a new power in the North Sea. The attack on Lindisfarne was a template for what was to come, hit-and-run raids on wealthy, poorly defended monasteries and coastal towns. The Vikings had discovered that England was rich and vulnerable. For the next 2 centuries, the sight of a longship on the horizon would mean fire, death, and the beginning of a long, desperate struggle for survival. The age of isolated raids was dawning, but it would soon give way to something far more organized and ambitious: full-scale invasion. For several decades after the shocking raid on Lindisfarne, the Viking threat remained a seasonal problem. Each summer, fleets of longships would appear off the English coasts, striking quickly at settlements before disappearing back across the sea with their loot and captives. These were not yet armies of conquest, but opportunistic raiders seeking portable wealth. To counter this, English kings began to pay them tribute, a form of protection money known as Danegeld. They hoped that by giving the Vikings silver, they could persuade them to leave in peace. However, this strategy proved to be a double-edged sword, as it demonstrated England's wealth and made it an even more tempting target for future attacks. The nature of the Viking threat began to change dramatically in the mid-9th century. The raids became larger, more organized, and more persistent. Instead of returning home for the winter, Viking war bands started to overwinter in England, establishing fortified camps from which they could launch deeper and more sustained campaigns. They were no longer just raiding the coasts. They were beginning to probe inland, moving along rivers and striking at the heart of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The payment of Danegeld became more frequent, and the sums demanded grew ever larger, crippling the English economy and revealing the weakness of its rulers to repel these determined aggressors. This escalation reached its terrifying peak in the autumn of 865. A massive Viking force, unlike anything seen before, landed in East Anglia. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles called it the Miselheer, the Great Heathen Army. This was not a raiding party, it was an army of conquest, led by legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson. Their goal was not simply to plunder and leave, but to conquer and settle. They spent the first winter in East Anglia, consolidating their forces and demanding horses from the local king, effectively turning his kingdom into their forward operating base for the subjugation of England. The Great Heathen Army then turned its attention north to the Kingdom of Northumbria, which was weakened by a bitter civil war. In 867, they stormed the great city of York, killing the rival kings who had foolishly united to fight them too late. With Northumbria subdued, the army moved south, systematically dismantling the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms one by one. In 869, they returned to East Anglia, captured and martyred its king Edmund, and absorbed his kingdom. Next, they pushed into Mercia, forcing its king into exile and installing a puppet ruler. By 871, only one kingdom remained standing against the tide, the Kingdom of Wessex in the south. With Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia all fallen or subjugated, the Kingdom of Wessex stood alone as the last bastion of Anglo-Saxon independence. Its young king Alfred had ascended to the throne in 871, not in a time of peace and celebration, but in the midst of a desperate war for survival. In his first year as king, he fought no fewer than 9 major battles against the Vikings, a relentless series of bloody encounters that highlighted the sheer scale of the threat he faced. The great heathen army, now led by the formidable warrior Guthrum, was determined to complete its conquest of England by extinguishing its last free kingdom. Wessex was on the brink of collapse. The pressure was immense, and by the winter of 878, Alfred's situation had become truly desperate. After a surprise Viking attack on his royal estate at Chippenham, the Wessex army was scattered. The king was forced to flee, becoming a fugitive in his own land. He retreated into the marshy, inaccessible wetlands of the Somerset levels, finding refuge on the Isle of Athelney. From this hidden stronghold, surrounded by bogs and swamps, Alfred began to wage a guerrilla war. He rallied what few loyal followers he could find, launching small-scale raids against the Viking occupiers. It was the lowest point of his reign, a moment when the dream of an independent England seemed all but lost. But even in the depths of despair, Alfred did not give up. He used his time in the wilderness to plan, to communicate with his loyal ealdormen, and to lay the groundwork for a dramatic comeback. He sent out messengers across the shires of Wessex, summoning the feared, the Anglo-Saxon militia, to muster at a rallying point known as Egbert's Stone. This was a huge gamble. He was calling on men from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire to leave their homes and risk everything on one last decisive battle. The response was a testament to the loyalty he still commanded. Men flocked to his banner, eager to fight for their king and reclaim their lands. In May 878, Alfred led his newly formed army to confront Guthrum's Viking force at a place called Edington. The battle that followed was ferocious and bloody, lasting for much of the day. Alfred's forces held their shield wall firm against the Viking onslaught, and eventually they broke the enemy line and won a decisive victory. The defeated Vikings fled back to their fortress at Chippenham, but Alfred pursued them, laying siege to the stronghold for 2 weeks. Starved and defeated, Guthrum was finally forced to surrender. The victory at Edington was a stunning reversal of fortune, a moment that saved Wessex and changed the course of English history forever. Alfred's victory at Edington was more than just a military triumph. It was the foundation upon which he would rebuild his kingdom and secure its future. The immediate result was the Treaty of Wedmore, an agreement made with the defeated Viking leader, Guthrum. As part of the treaty, Guthrum and his leading chieftains agreed to be baptized, with Alfred himself standing as godfather. This was a hugely symbolic act. It brought the Viking leader into the Christian fold, theoretically making him a spiritual subject of Alfred. More practically, the treaty established a formal boundary, dividing England between the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Wessex and the Viking-controlled territories to the north and east, which would become known as the Danelaw. Realizing that peace was fragile, Alfred embarked on an ambitious program of military reforms to protect his kingdom from future attacks. He knew he could not rely on luck or last-minute victories. His most significant innovation was the creation of a network of fortified towns, or burhs, strategically placed across Wessex. These were not just fortresses, but also centers of commerce and administration, designed so that no part of the kingdom was more than a day's march from a place of safety. Each burh was garrisoned and maintained by the surrounding population, creating a permanent kingdom-wide defensive system that could thwart Viking raiding parties. Alfred also reorganized the army itself. He reformed the feared, the Anglo-Saxon militia, by dividing it into 2 rotating contingents. One half would be on active duty at any given time, while the other half remained at home, tending to their farms. This ensured that Wessex always had a standing army ready to respond to threats, without crippling the kingdom's agricultural economy. Furthermore, he invested in building a navy, commissioning the construction of new, larger ships designed to his own specifications to intercept Viking fleets at sea before they could even make landfall. These military reforms were revolutionary, creating a far more resilient and professional fighting force. Beyond military matters, Alfred was a ruler with a deep sense of cultural and spiritual purpose. He believed the Viking invasions were a divine punishment for a decline in learning and piety. To remedy this, he launched a remarkable educational program. He learned Latin himself and gathered scholars from across Britain and Europe to his court. He then initiated a project to translate key religious and philosophical texts from Latin into Old English, making them accessible to his people. By promoting literacy and learning, Alfred sought to restore England's spiritual health and create a shared Anglo-Saxon identity, laying the intellectual foundations for a unified English nation. Alfred the Great had saved Wessex and laid the foundations for a unified England. But the task of realizing that vision actually fell to his successors. His son, Edward the Elder, and his formidable daughter, Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, continued his work with great energy and strategic brilliance. Working in a remarkable political and military partnership, the brother and sister duo systematically pushed back the borders of the Danelaw. Ethelflaed, a skilled military leader in her own right, led the Mercian armies, building a chain of burhs that mirrored her father's system and reclaiming key towns like Derby and Leicester from Danish control. Edward, meanwhile, extended Wessex's authority over the southern Danelaw. This process of reconquest was not just about military might, it was also about political consolidation. As Edward and Ethelflaed captured Danish-held territories, they incorporated them into their growing kingdom, imposing their rule and administration. When Ethelflaed died in 918, Edward moved swiftly to absorb Mercia fully into his kingdom, uniting the two largest Anglo-Saxon realms under a single ruler for the first time. This was a crucial step. The old divisions that had made Anglo-Saxon England so vulnerable to the Vikings were finally being erased, replaced by a new, larger political entity that was beginning to look like a single, unified kingdom of the English. The culmination of this ambition came with Alfred's grandson, Aethelstan, who ascended to the throne in 925. Aethelstan was a man of immense ambition and vision, determined to finish the work his grandfather had started. He was not content with ruling over just Wessex and Mercia. In 927, he marched north and captured the great Viking city of York, the capital of the last remaining independent Viking kingdom in England. Following this stunning victory, he summoned the other rulers of Britain, including the kings of the Scots and the Welsh, to meet him at Aymont Bridge. There they acknowledged his overlordship, making Aethelstan the first king to rule over the whole of what we now call England. Aethelstan's reign marked a high point for the House of Wessex. He styled himself not merely as King of the Anglo-Saxons, but as Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain. He was a major figure on the European stage, marrying his sisters into the great royal houses of the continent. He continued Alfred's work of legal and administrative reform, issuing laws, minting a standardized coinage that was accepted across the entire kingdom, and promoting a sense of a single English identity. The dream of a united England, born in the darkest days of the Viking invasions, had now become a reality under the powerful and visionary rule of Aethelstan. Aethelstan's claim to be the king of all England did not go unchallenged. His conquest of Northumbria and his assertion of overlordship over the other rulers of Britain created a powerful coalition of enemies against him. In the year 937, a massive army gathered to destroy him and shatter his newly forged kingdom. This grand alliance was led by Olaf Guthfrithson, the Viking king of Dublin, who sought to reclaim his family's throne in York. He was joined by Constantine II, the king of Scots, and Owain, the king of Strathclyde. It was a formidable force, a combined army of Vikings, Scots, and Britons, all united by their desire to crush the rising power of the Anglo-Saxon king. the two armies met at a location known as Brunanburh, a site whose exact whereabouts are still debated by historians today. What is not debated is the sheer scale and importance of the battle that followed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, breaking from its usual terse style, records the event in a long and triumphant poem, calling it the greatest slaughter since the Anglo-Saxons first came to Britain. For an entire day, the armies clashed in a brutal and bloody struggle. Aethelstan and his younger brother Edmund led the West Saxon and Mercian forces from the front, fighting with a ferocity that matched their enemies. The poem in the Chronicle describes the battlefield as a place where the field of battle flowed with the blood of men. The West Saxons and Mercians hacked their way through the shield walls of their opponents, pursuing the fleeing invaders until nightfall. The victory for Aethelstan was total and overwhelming. The great coalition against him was utterly smashed. 5 kings and 7 of Olaf's earls were said to have been killed in the fighting. Olaf Guthfrithson fled back to Dublin with only a remnant of his army, and Constantine II retreated north, having lost his son in the battle. The threat to English unity had been decisively defeated. Brunanburh is often considered a pivotal moment in the making of England. It confirmed through trial by combat the dominance of the House of Wessex and the reality of a single, united English kingdom. Aethelstan's victory sent a powerful message to all his neighbors that England was a force to be reckoned with, and its unity was not to be easily broken. The battle secured the northern borders and cemented the inclusion of Northumbria within the English crown. For the first time, a sense of shared Englishness, forged in the fires of the long war against the Vikings, had been successfully defended by a king who ruled all the English people. The unity forged by Aethelstan and his successors was not destined to last forever. After a period of relative peace and stability under capable kings like Edgar the Peaceful, the English throne passed in 978 to a young and ill-fated ruler named Ethelred. History has given him the nickname the Unready, which is actually a mistranslation of the Old English unread, meaning ill-advised or poorly counseled. It was a fitting title. His long and troubled reign was marked by political indecision, treacherous court politics, and most disastrously of all, a devastating new wave of Viking attacks. The storm that had receded for a generation was about to return with a vengeance. This time, the Viking raiders were different. They were not disparate bands of adventurers, but highly organized, professional armies, often led by powerful Scandinavian kings seeking to build empires of their own. Figures like Sweyn Forkbeard, the king of Denmark, and Olaf Tryggvason, the future king of Norway, led massive fleets that systematically plundered England's wealth. Their campaigns were more intense and destructive than anything seen since the days of the Great Heathen Army. The defensive system of burhs, so effective in Alfred's time, proved less capable of dealing with these large mobile royal armies that could strike deep into the heart of the country. Faced with this overwhelming military pressure and plagued by poor advice from his counselors, Ethelred resorted to the old, failed policy of paying tribute. He began to levy enormous national taxes to raise the silver needed for ever larger Danegeld payments. In 991, after a defeat at the Battle of Malden, he paid 10,000 pounds of silver. Just a few years later, the price had risen to 16,000, then 24,000, and eventually a staggering 48,000 pounds. These huge payments drained the kingdom of its wealth, incentivized further attacks, and revealed the deep weakness at the heart of Aethelred's government. The Vikings simply took the money and came back a few years later, demanding more. Ethelred's reign spiraled into disaster. In a desperate and foolish act of policy, on St. Brice's Day in 1002, he ordered the massacre of all Danes living in England, fearing they were plotting against him. This atrocity may have included the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard among its victims, giving the Danish king a personal reason for revenge on top of his political ambitions. Sweyn's invasions became campaigns of outright conquest. Over the next decade, he relentlessly harried England, until in 1013, he forced Ethelred to flee into exile in Normandy. For the first time, a foreign king had conquered the entire kingdom of England. The unity Aethelstan had fought for at Brunanburh was in tatters. Sweyn Forkbeard's triumph was short-lived. He died just weeks after being proclaimed King of England in 1014. His death created a power vacuum, allowing Ethelred to briefly return from exile. However, the fight for the throne was taken up by Sweyn's ambitious and capable son, Canute, sometimes called Canute. Canute returned to England with a powerful fleet and engaged in a brutal war against Ethelred's son, the fierce warrior king Edmund Ironside. After a series of hard-fought battles, the two rivals agreed to divide the kingdom between them. But when Edmund died suddenly in late 1016, Canute was left as the undisputed master of all England. A Viking now sat on the English throne. Rather than ruling as a brutal foreign conqueror, Canute proved to be a remarkably wise and effective king. He understood that to rule England successfully, he needed the support of the English people, not just the fear of his Danish army. He issued a proclamation promising to rule according to the laws of his respected predecessor, King Edgar the Peaceful. He divided England into 4 great earldoms: Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria, placing both Danes and Englishmen in positions of power. This shrewd move helped to integrate his followers while also reassuring the Anglo-Saxon nobility that they still had a place in the new order. Canute was more than just the King of England. He was also the King of Denmark and Norway, and he held sway over parts of Sweden. He was the ruler of a vast North Sea empire, with England as its wealthiest and most powerful component. He used his immense wealth and power to bring stability and peace to his realms. He protected England from any further Viking attacks. After all, he was the most powerful Viking of them all. He promoted trade, issued a reliable currency, and became a great patron of the church, making generous donations to monasteries and even going on a pilgrimage to Rome in 1027, where he was received as a major European sovereign. Under Canute's rule, English and Danish cultures continued to mix and merge. The years of conflict had already led to significant Scandinavian settlement, particularly in the Danelaw, which left a lasting mark on the language, laws, and place names of northern and eastern England. Canute's reign accelerated this process of integration at the very highest levels of society. He governed as an English king, respecting the country's traditions, while simultaneously being the head of a Scandinavian empire. His reign demonstrated that an England ruled by a Dane could be peaceful, prosperous, and secure, creating a unique Anglo-Scandinavian kingdom that commanded respect across Europe. The great North Sea Empire, forged by Canute, was a personal creation, held together by his own strength and political skill. It did not long survive his death in 1035. His sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, lacked their father's ability, and their reigns were short and troubled. Their squabbles over the succession weakened the Danish hold on the English throne, and after Harthacnut's death in 1042, the English nobility seized the opportunity to restore the old Anglo-Saxon royal line. They invited Ethelred, the unready son Edward, to return from his long exile in Normandy and take the crown. Edward, known to history as the Confessor for his piety, became king. Edward's reign brought a period of relative peace, but the kingdom he inherited was a changed place. It was a unified state with a sophisticated system of government, a national currency, and a network of shires and earldoms, a structure that was the product of both Anglo-Saxon resilience and Viking adaptation. The long struggle had forged a stronger sense of English identity. However, the throne itself was unstable. Edward had spent most of his life in Normandy and had Norman friends and advisors, which caused friction with the powerful Anglo-Saxon earls, particularly the ambitious Godwin family of Wessex. The kingdom was politically fractured beneath the surface. The legacy of the Viking Age had also created a complex web of succession claims. Edward the Confessor died childless in January 1066, triggering a massive crisis. The English Witan, or Council of Leading Men, chose the most powerful earl, Harold Godwinson, to be king. But there were other claimants with strong, and in their eyes, legitimate claims to the throne. Harald Hardrada, the ferocious king of Norway, saw himself as the heir to Canute's empire and prepared a massive invasion force to take what he believed was his. The centuries of Viking involvement in England had created a Scandinavian claim that would not be easily ignored. At the same time, another claimant watched from across the English Channel. William, Duke of Normandy, asserted that King Edward had promised him the throne years earlier. The Normans themselves were descended from Viking raiders who had settled in northern France, a fact that added yet another layer of complexity to the unfolding drama. The Viking Age had not truly ended. It had simply set the stage for one final, cataclysmic conflict. In 1066, England, a kingdom forged and unified through 2 centuries of resistance to Viking invasion, would face 2 separate invasions from claimants with Viking heritage. The long and bloody story that began at Lindisfarne was about to reach its dramatic and transformative conclusion.